Hello, on today's podcast, I am interviewing Sarah Rue, who is a village witch or known as a village witch on social media, but she's also a herbalist and works with permaculture as well. So welcome, Sarah.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, Ben.
So just to begin, to give people a bit of background about your work and what you're doing, can you start by telling us how your story began, so how you got into the work that you're doing?
Thank you. Well, yes, so I've been practicing herbalism for 23 years and permaculture for the last 14. And a lot of it began mostly due, especially with herbalism, mostly due to my own personal health and wellness journey. Specifically, just feeling quite dissatisfied and failed by healthcare systems. That really, healthcare workers are lovely people, but the system created isn't one that's really there to foster wellness and well-being and optimal health. And so my interest in herbalism came through that, with really trying to find my own way to nourish myself and take care of myself, and also empower myself to heal and bring into balance what was happening for me. And then with permaculture in particular, it was right around the same time when I became very interested in just the environmental movement and very aware of, I mean, I was always kind of aware, but I think very aware of just the environmental injustice that's happening. I went to Costa Rica when I was 19 years old to study tropical ecology, and what really became apparent was just how devastating our food system is. And I grew up in New York State, which is pretty much filled with cornfields and soy fields and, genetically modified everything, and a lot of crop dusting and heavy agricultural chemical inputs. So that was pretty apparent to me as a young person that was happening, but I didn't realize how wrong it was until, I was a late teenager, early into my 20s. And so that really took me down the path of informing myself about the state of our food system, the state of our medical care. And then through that, you start to investigate and experience a lot of different things, from, finding new groups of people who are working, studying, living, in these ways that I was curious about, to working in the organic food industry and, educating people about the necessity for, low impact food, specifically with like agricultural inputs. And also with body care and supplementation and all of that, and then eventually moving into consumer education, specifically around social injustice in food and farmers' rights and those types of things. And so that then led me back to Costa Rica in 2009, where I started living on an off-the-grid permaculture farm and education center. And so that was a time when I was very much immersed into just, everything that at least tropical permaculture could look like, um, as well as living in community and getting to actually practice herbalism in a way that I didn't have an opportunity for when I was living in the US, because in the early 2000s, it was still pretty fringe. Now it's quite popular, which I'm very happy about. But it was still pretty fringe, and it was hard, to develop a client base. It was hard to work just because of, it was kind of seen as a little too out there, and people didn't trust so much yet. Now of course we're so lucky in many ways as herbalists, and that it's very popular, and there's more herb schools than ever, and people practicing a lot of varying kinds of information out there for people to ascertain, which is really great. And I feel so happy that I stuck to that path, because herbalism proven for me, and permaculture has proven for me over and over again, just the relevance of it in the current world situation. and specifically, learning how to work with the land, learning how to filter water, learning how to grow food, learning how to, work with the medicines in your yard, to also learning how to just be humans in relationship with other humans in a way that's, fair, in a way that's just and peaceful, and, small steps. But it does give me a lot of hope for humanity when it's really hard to have hope sometimes, looking at
Yeah.
the current situation. So,
Mm.
yeah.
I find it really interesting as well that you came from the city, and that must have been quite hard, because obviously you need the land to be able to really practice herbalism and permaculture. So was that something that inspired you as well, to have like the actual physical space to grow food and crops? Yeah.
It's a good question. I grew up in actually upstate New York. So in New York State is a few big cities. I'm from a big city called Rochester, which is surrounded by very rural spaces. So I grew up actually like kind of on the edge of the suburbs. And then I lived in Philadelphia for university, which is another major city in the US. And it was actually interesting to be learning herbalism at that point, and to be beginning practices and in studies, because so much of the plant life in our urban spaces is very much coming from a place of struggle. It's like the plants are pushing through sidewalks, and they're really adaptive, and so it was interesting, like learning what was coming through sidewalks and growing in urban gardens, and even into the local inner city parks and stuff like that. But it was definitely not getting the opportunity to live with the natural world. And and for me, with practicing with human beings, it's like there's very much like the kind of, it can still be holistic medicine, but when you're just working with teas and tinctures and supplements and store-bought food all the time, it's quite different from working and living with living plants and
Mm.
living people, and going out to harvest and wildcraft and growing and those types of things. So yeah, I mean, for me, it was a major advancement in practice, was to get to live with the ecosystem. And I think it is part of the limitation of urban dwelling, when we want to work with plants, even though there are so many projects now that are in every city. You see them, urban gardens and community gardens, and people practicing permaculture in the city, which is really beautiful and really inspiring. And I think so necessary for that that deep connection that so many humans need to come back to other living creatures, and realize their humanity through those relationships.
Mm. And I think it's really fascinating as well when you're working with the land and you have that space to grow. You see all aspects of it. You don't just see the finished project. You like you're saying, you see like it from the seed to the growth of the plant and then the harvest of it. So yeah, that's so interesting. And from some of your projects, is this something that's really come through for you as well? Like maybe working with like permaculture and
Yeah, what I see so often is there's we have this like really deep sense of urgency, because it's just everything's kind of collapsing right now, from the climate to our economies to political systems and borders and all of that. And so, um, for me, like the metaphor even of like seed into sprout, it's like we're very much in a transitional phase, of going into the compost system of lifestyles that aren't working anymore. And so we will be reseeding, and that's what we're doing right now, even by having this
mm,
conversation. We're planting new seeds, and moving with the plants in their rhythm is, it's very it's reassuring, and also a little like, it can be a little frustrating sometimes too, because you probably see images of these beautiful, lush places. They're like pumping food and the gardens look so beautiful. And, what the story isn't told is like how hard it is to work with the land, and that
Mm.
like our lands are pretty damaged and water's not as available as it always was, or how it used to be in different situations. And so, like when we're starting to plant, like we're, for example, here at our land that we're caring for in Italy, we have a hectare, which is like 2 acres. And here, it's the lands are pretty they're pretty devastated in this country and in many countries, a lot of monocrops. And while the Italian farming is quite natural, they don't use a lot of, agricultural inputs like pesticides or fungicides or anything like that. It's like the soils are very compacted, they're very clay. And so you're doing a lot in just the first years of trying to bring soil back. And so, yeah, we have some good harvests, like potatoes and tomatoes, and our fruit trees are still really little. And so it's like every season you're just kind of looking at your fruit trees, like, waiting for them to get big. And it's just a reminder of, that nature is slow and adaptation is also slow. And it's really hard for the human mind, which is set in urgency,
Yeah.
so that's like the big thing. And then I also have land, I live on land in Costa Rica and work in a project there and live at a project there called Tacotal. And there we're a community and we're 25 people and caring for a piece of land that's 30 hectares, so like a little over 70 acres. And or 35 hectares, excuse me. And in that land project, we get to see things grow much faster because it's the tropics. And so everything's just like sped up. So you start to eat from the land much faster. Within a season, you're eating from the land in a different way than we are in temperate climates, but there we're also dealing with water in other ways. It's like here, especially in Southern Europe, where desertification is happening and fires are happening. Water is very scarce and being shipped in from other countries, that are economically dependent on exporting their water. And in Costa Rica, for example, it's quite the opposite because we have so much water. And so it's like trying to figure out actually what to do with it and how to move it through our land and how to, protect riversides and coastlines and those types of things. So it's interesting once you start working with land. And if you do, or if you are as fortunate as I am to be able to migrate like I do, I get to experience different ecosystems and how people relate and what personalities are even like and how they're really formed based on relationship with ecosystem, which is quite beautiful and interesting and hard all at the same time. Mhm.
I think that's so fascinating. I think as well, at the moment, I the reason I feel culture is kind of waking up to the benefits of herbalism and permaculture is because it comes back to it affecting their own ecosystem personally. Because I think if we go back to the idea of a slow lifestyle, which we can learn from nature, and like society and culture has just taught us that everything should be fast and on demand and mass produced for so long, that I think our bodies have just become hyper vigilant and overstimulated, and that leads to burnout. A
Mhm.
lot of people are getting burnout and realizing that their lifestyles aren't actually supporting their health and well-being. So I think for me personally as well, like the more I learn about herbalism and permaculture and just nature in general, the more it helps me to slow down. And the more I slow down with the rhythms of nature, the more healthier I feel. Um, but like you said, it is a process and it can be quite hard because it really does test your patience.
Yeah, it sure does. Yeah, and when I speak to people, I believe that like when like, well, what can I do, to start to live more holistically, or what can I do to start to live a little bit more environmentally mindful? What can I do to, have like a more balanced, lifestyle? And it's some of the things that I think are most important is actually seasonal living, and living with the biorhythms of the land where you are. And so it's, in the capitalist model of continuous production, we don't get time off. And the time we get off is scheduled in certain seasons. And a lot of times the scheduled seasons for time off is actually of high activity. It's like summer
Mm.
vacation types of things, when really maybe that that time off we need is like in winter, when we can go into a really deep rest cycle. And so our many of our modern, you know, professions and everything, and ways of being don't actually fall in line with the biorhythms of nature. It's like you
Mm.
still have to wake up at 7 a.m. when it's dark out in the middle of winter to go to the job, and and to be in climate controlled buildings and eating food that's shipped from around the world and out of season, like eating strawberries or even, melons or certain fruits in the wintertime is very contradictory to what the body really wants in the wintertime if you're living in colder temperate climates. Um, Whereas like in the spring, there is naturally more activity and more excitement. And when I think of like the goal of capitalism, for example, is maximizing productivity. I feel like if they really got in line, with biorhythms, they'd probably actually be more successful and people wouldn't have burnout. But it's not quite
Yeah.
quite the case. It's like that 24 hours a day access to information and having to answer your phone. And for how many of you out there listening, like when you're getting an email, you feel, or a message, you feel that urgency to respond right away, and you remember, maybe some of you listening, and when it was like your phone would ring and you didn't know who was on the other line.
Yeah.
you know or you could like mute the phone so it wouldn't even ring, and you didn't even know, you didn't even get your calls. Or if you were away, doing something, you had to figure out how to find each other and stick with plans and those types of things. And so I think the immediacy of tech is amazing. It's why we're here right now, and how you can communicate and inform yourselves, but it also has a lot of limitations in giving us that sense of urgency, which is kind of false. It's like, what do we really need to be moving so fast?
Mm.
So yeah, I believe that studying nature and getting outside, and following the pattern of the sun, even with your sleep rhythms and your energetic rhythms, like is really important, to being able to live a lifestyle that is fostering a form of wellness, mental wellness, physical wellness, spiritual wellness, all of it.
Mm.
So I think is rooted in what's right outside our windows.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think as well, like, do you think the sense of urgency that today's society culture has or gives us, mainly through technology and just lifestyle, how do you think that affects our body? Because I really feel like it dysregulates our nervous system.
Mhm.
Because if we're always feeling like, oh, I have to do this next, yeah, our nervous system just becomes dysregulated. Is
Mhm.
that what you
Yeah,
found?
nervous system as well as the endocrine system and your immune system, like they're all very much connected. And so many people are running in a high end adrenal phase, where your adrenal glands, which are these little glands above your kidneys, they're there specifically to release certain hormones that tell our bodies to reserve fat, such as cortisol, right? In times of potential starvation or flight, and there's not going to be a lot of food. There's certain chemicals like adrenaline and epinephrine, which, come in to give us like major lung capacity and ability to run for our lives, but those same that same glandular system also is there to help us to go into deep rest and to pacify us into being, rest and relax phase. And so like what happens with these senses of urgency is that we're put into a fight or flight mode, fight, flight, or freeze, actually. And And so our bodies are in this like agitated state, which is actually also communicating directly with the nervous system, right? Via the hypothalamus. Like our body, it's the nervous system and the endocrine system are in this constant communication back and forth with each other. And so when the endocrine system, or the adrenal glands in particular, are very excited, and also this comes from drinking coffee, they get very excited, and then the nervous system becomes overreactive, and then it just becomes a feedback loop that actually moves into an exhaustion phase. And you get so exhausted, it's seen as a threat to the body, which will then put you back into a fight or flight mode, right? We
Mhm.
call that GAS, which is the general adaptation syndrome that people have. And then we're exhausted, and so we drink coffee, and coffee doesn't actually wake the mind up, it stimulates the adrenal glands to go back into fight or flight mode. And it becomes this really terrible cycle of overstimulation. And then also, like, as um, more ancient people, for example, when we had to fight or flight for ourselves, we actually got to burn out that adrenaline that was in our bodies. And now instead, we're sitting in our vehicles, we're sitting behind our desk, or we're sitting on public transportation and feeling very agitated and not actually moving our bodies to release it. And so it stays very heightened in our bodies, and through time does affect other endocrine functions such as reproductive health, mental health, metabolism, as well as really lowers the function of our immune systems,
Mm.
to fight off infections and diseases, cancerous cells, viruses, all the things. Like through time, we become weaker and weaker, and um, yeah, just more susceptible to d rapid degeneration.
Mm. I find it
Mhm.
so fascinating. Like it really is something like what you were saying about we go into this state of fight, flight, freeze, um, but we're not actually taking that action. Our bodies aren't taking the action, so we're storing it all inside of us.
Yeah.
Which obviously our bodies are primal kind of instincts are to react and put that into action. But because we're not putting that into action, like you were saying, and we're just sitting at the desk or sitting on the train, that's all that kind of feelings are stored in the body, which I think is why somatic experiences and yoga and things like this are really, really helpful to kind of release this as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's some of
So
the best therapy actually before even taking, herbs and supplements. Movement is critical for.
yeah.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to ask you as well about some of the projects that you've worked on, because I know you've worked all over the world on some really interesting projects. You've worked Costa Rica, Portugal, Italy, and I found you through the work that you was doing in Portugal. So can you just talk about that permaculture project in Portugal a little bit about that?
Sure. So I teach is my main right livelihood, and I really love being an educator. And in Portugal, I had a sense for Portugal. I mean, living in Costa Rica, you hear a lot about other places that are kind of on the path. There's a trajectory around the world. It's like people go to Costa Rica, they go to Bali, they go to, Goa, they go to Ibiza, they go to, they end up in Portugal, they go to Tulum. It's all on the same kind of tourist map, shamanic tourist map.
Yeah.
And so I had been hearing about Portugal for a while, and I was like, oh, I wonder what's happening over there. I was kind of curious, like, to see. And I had really I started to dream for myself back in 2016, 17 about having a migration pattern. I was really trying to see what other climates would be like, and also coming back home to Costa Rica and just making, more connections for teaching and community. And so I had this sense of Portugal, and I was like, well, what's happening there? What's happening there? It took me a few years to get there, and what eventually brought me there was that I was seeking online, and this is one of the beauties of social media, right? I was looking at like the Permaculture Portugal hashtag, and I found my teaching partner and very dear friend, Eduardo Tercides. And I found this person, and they were very much in line with my personal philosophies on permaculture, as more than just, regenerative land projects, but also really looking at like what is the deeper meaning here for permaculturists as a social movement. And I found Eduardo, and I was sharing with him this idea I had of this class called Soul to Soil, which is helping to connect people back with their roots and help them to really figure out what their personal niche is, because so often we're like, what's our purpose? What are we doing here? This and this and that. And people feel very lost. And when we're children, we're asked, who do we want to be when we grow up? Or what do we want to do when we grow up? And, it's a very, again, like exploitive capitalism perspective on child rearing. And so we've had this like ingrained. And so helping people to really see like, what is your true heart's desire, and what is your star, and like, what is your guiding light, and what does that mean, and how can you also merge that into lifestyle, and merge that possibly into creating a livelihood for yourself. And so when I found him in Portugal in particular, I think that that's what was really calling me was to meet this person who, again, is a dear friend and co-teacher and colleague. And so we developed this course, Soul to Soil, which is a 125-hour course. We actually just got done teaching it. I arrived back just a few days ago from teaching that course in Portugal, and really lovely. We go through all of the earth sciences that the permaculture design course does contain, as well as lots of different social exercises, from learning about like authentic relating and grieving for the world, and um, looking at like what your personal gifts are, and how does that fit in to culture, and so in many ways we're trying to make a new culture that's not based on the need to just be highly productive all the time. And it's a slow process, and when I see all of the tragedy in the world that feels so hopeless, I look at those people, and it just reminds me of also just the beauty of humanity, and that there's so much goodness also happening. um, and and trying to like be informed and aware of the tragedies, and also really keeping the hope that as in our projects, in the work that we do, is that like we're really trying to nurture for the future, and it might not be the world that we get to see, but it doesn't mean that we can't create something more beautiful for generations to come. And that's one of my most passionate projects that I work on through education is that keeping that seed of hope alive, and that seed of action alive, and that it does take more than just hope and prayer. It takes like people physically doing the work, whether it's growing food, or whether it's tending to harmed bodies, or whether it's working in political systems, or whether it's teaching, and or talking like we are today. I think that really keeps that alive for human beings, just to remember who we are in relationship to this big world out here, and to humble us a little bit, and also empower us in it at the same time.
Yeah, I really love the name of that course, Soul to Soil, and also what you were saying about you're kind of planting seeds for the future as well. I think that's really potent, because like nature, things take time. You plant your seed, and then in the future, whether it's a year later, you see that blooming. So yeah, it's so nice to think that what the work that you're doing now, or the work that people want to start doing now, is something that they can see for their future ahead of them as well. So
yeah, and it helps to moderate a little bit that sense of urgency as well. Even though we do feel it, and we're like, oh, but I want to be eating from these trees, or I want to be doing this and this right now. It's like, that's just not how it really is.
yeah,
And so it becomes a pretty steady practice of trying to slow yourself down. And I think some of the very first steps are actually not feeling the urgency to respond on your phones right away. Because look how when we respond really fast, we also see we say things that,
Mm,
feeling at the time, but we don't actually want to say, and then we say it, you know, and
yeah.
or we, that hyper reactivity can be really, harmful in
Mm.
big and small ways.
Yeah, I think you're like as well as just more thought put into things. Things are more
Mhm.
thought process rather than reactional.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, yeah, and more heart led, more soul led, which is really lovely. Yeah. Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
thank you for joining me today. Is there anything that you want to share with us, like any new projects that you've got coming up, or?
Yeah, and so for people who are interested in learning a few different things, I'm going to be having a series of classes in person in Costa Rica this year, as well as in Guatemala. So I work in Guatemala a few times a year as well. So in January, we're going to have a Green Witch Herbalism immersion, which will be looking at our practical magic type of things. So a lot of medicine making and prayer and ritual. Then we're gonna have an art and herbalism workshop, which will be at my home in Costa Rica in February. And so making
Oh,
nature art with the plants, and it's so fun.
that's
We're
amazing.
doing yeah, the medicine making herbal apprenticeship is in March, and it's 12 days of pure hands-on skill building. And it's the end of March. And then next October, we have Permaculture for the Herbalist Path, which is a very in depth 200-hour